Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Spark Your Fire. It's your host, David Shih here, and as always, I've got John Comino with me today. John, how are you, mate?
Very well, David. Really good. Yeah. How are you doing?
Good. Yes. It's been a hot few days in Sydney, I gotta say.
Yeah, bring it
Scorcher.
on.
I think we've been hitting like 34 degrees, whereas when I talk to the fellow people, fellow Queenslanders up there, they're kind of, yeah, no, we're not getting that kind of temperatures. I was like, well, for the first time, Sydney is actually trumping up in Queensland for that type of that.
Yes. It's cooled right down though, and I always think every time it gets hot in spring or summer, we always panic, and it was like this except for last year and the year before. It was always hot, but yes, no, it's nice, and yeah, it's a bit of respite now, but
Yeah,
all good, all
I
good.
think it's a welcome change, basically, in terms of that cool breeze that we have. Although, having said that, I think next week it's going to start to heat up again. So let's see.
Yeah.
Just a bit like the property market, don't you think? It goes hot and cold, hot and cold a little bit, to a degree that we're seeing at the moment.
Waves of the ocean. Everything is a cycle. Yes, of course.
Exactly. Well, listeners, look, I think today we want to, we're a bit late in terms of the month cycles now to talk about the data. So we're going to give that a miss this week, and we're going to cut straight into our discussion topics in this recording. So I think the key area in this topic is quite relevant when I think about it. We all know that a lot of investors are looking to sell, or as a matter of fact, they're putting their properties on market for sale. And John and I were talking before coming on air, thinking, well, what would be the decision point, or what would be the thinking behind the investors on deciding which property, if they've got a portfolio, which would be the bad eggs to get rid of in the current market, right? So it was an interesting topic that we thought, why don't we give it a go and have a chat around it in terms of putting John and David's head on. If we are to sell our own portfolio today, what will be the kind of criteria that would make us trigger that decision to say, this is the bad egg, this is the one that we should sell, and the first one that we should get rid of.
Yeah.
So that's what we're gonna have a chat around today, and I think we'll as always we'll make this a bit more conversational and discussion oriented. There's obviously no right or wrong answers. It's just our opinions at the end of the day. So, but look, I think I certainly have a case study that I can share. For myself. I don't know about you, John, but I think most listeners who I guess heard of my story before would know that I have a property. As a matter of fact, my first off-the-plan property in Granville. It was a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit, which I bought back in about 2009, brand new from a reputable developer back at that time. And it was in Granville, but as a matter of fact, it was closer to Maryland's. Okay, so even though the postcode is Granville, but it's a lot closer to Maryland's. Now, using that as a bit of a, I guess, case study, we kind of thought that could lead to a few conclusions that we have. And the first one, when I picked that one as the one that I would likely to sell first, is due to the supply. There's literally infinite supply around the area with the Parramatta Council, which basically, they just approve all these high rises. When I bought this unit back in 2009, that area was still predominantly houses. We're only seeing like low rises, maybe up to 3 level. The whole street, was not filled with units. But now when I drive around the streets, it's all filled up with units now, just over the years. So to me, that supply is the big issue. If you constantly have new supplies that's being approved, which means, sky's the limit. Basically, you can build as much as you like, and there's no limit in terms of that. That's going to put a lid on the value of the property in terms of how much it can grow, in that sense. So, when I think about that, that reduces the chance of basically having capital growth perspectives, and it also reduces, it increases the risk of vacancies moving forward as well, because they're just going to keep popping out new properties. And when tenants have options of different properties, then you're going to have to reduce rent in order to attract new tenants coming in. So it's going to take a hit on both capital growth as well as rental perspectives, purely just because of the supply factor. So, John, what do you think about supply? Have you got something that you can share with us, or your perspectives on that?
Yes, supply is very important. I mean, it produces very lumpy returns. I mean, Parramatta's the prime example here, and Parramatta and surrounds areas, for those who know the Sydney market. All this supply would come on in bursts, and it would essentially dampen particularly apartment returns for years and years and years until it moved up again. And so rather than getting consistent, nearly linear returns of, let's say, 4 or 5% per year, you would get no returns followed by 20% in a year or two. And that's the risk you take with areas with lots of supply. I mean, if you're buying, I think in your example, it was a fairly new apartment too, or off the plan. So then you've got to contend with those headwinds as well, about with new supply. So new supply is probably one of the main things, I think, in terms of knowing if you've got the wrong area. I mean, there's a couple of different ways to answer this question of when you sell. There's when do you need to sell due to your own circumstances, and we can cover this because there are always circumstances that would require you to sell. And then there's the question, how do you know when you bought a dud?
Yeah.
And so we should definitely cover that off as well. Now, the property that you bought was probably excellent in an area with too much supply. So then there's all these, you got the right or wrong type of property, but then the suburb was going through a transformation. So supply is a big indicator as to whether the suburb is changing. So, I mean, it's probably the most important thing, isn't it?
I actually do think it is one of the most important thing, and one of the thing that you can't foresee to a degree as well. Like,
yeah,
at that time when I bought it, I certainly wasn't expecting they're just going to continue to release like what they're doing today, basically making it a concrete jungle around Parramatta, right? I certainly wasn't seeing that. And at the time, when I was looking around Maryland's, there's dedicated bus bays in terms of that. So from a transport perspective, okay, well, surely they want to do something. There's Stockland Mall that's very, very near the shopping, the transport as well. So it's got a lot of things that kind of ticks off, from that investment perspective. But definitely the supply was something that I was not foreseeing, and that, when I look at it right now, is the main killer. Yeah. But then it raises a question, John. I don't know, this might be a question for you, very impromptu. How would you be able to tell, or how would you know what the future plan could be? Like, if I knew the answer to this question today, would I make a different decision 10 years ago in buying that?
Yeah. So councils have these sorts of things. I mean, if you lived in Epping, you would know that all the areas about to transform. North Ryde as well. You would know. But I mean, to some degree, none of us can think that big. You can't think that North Ryde is going to become sort of Silicon Valley of Australia in 15 years, and it's going to go from semi-regional to high rise in 15 years. And that I grew up in Eastwood. That's where I grew up. So I think it's actually not possible to know long scale transformations. Let me give you another example. If you lived in Detroit in the United States, now Detroit was the richest city on the planet in the 1950s, and now it's one of the poorest cities in America. How do you know that the automotive industry is going to get shipped to Japan or China or Vietnam or whatever it is, or Mexico in those cases? Well, how do you know? So some of these trends are too big. Offshoring of manufacturing, that it's too big to know. So you can watch, you have to trust your eyes, and you can see when things are going up, and when apartments are being flooded into the market. And I think you just have to kind of trust your own instincts on these things. To give you an example of where the opposite is the case, where there's never any new supply. Somewhere like Mossman, I mean, all the expensive areas, Coogee, the eastern suburbs. These Mossman is famous for not having any new supply come on board. I mean, it is what it is, and those are premium markets. So there's a reason that those markets are premium, and so supply, again, we keep going. It is probably the biggest driver, and you want to find markets where you have sort of an activist population resisting new supply coming on board. But you know what, we if we're going to have a growing population, we have to put our people somewhere. So they have the right to live somewhere as well.
Speaking of which, I think obviously seeing what I know, seeing what I see, or knowing what I know today, I think didn't Chris Minns just announced there's going to be a big focus in terms of all those areas that's going to get developed in the next, I don't know, 30 years or something, including areas like Macquarie Park, Sydney Central, Eveley. They basically that's the idea of putting more affordable apartments into those areas so they can house more people. Probably a great example when you think about that, right? Like if you knew information, would you be buying in those kind of areas, knowing that they're going to be concentrated apartments, blocks built around those areas in order to house those new people, new immigrants coming in?
Yeah, so no, I wouldn't want to be in any area that the government is getting involved in. I think they have the opposite of the Midas touch, and that's both sides. It's not a political. I wouldn't want.
Of course.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to own that. But then it comes back to a slightly different question: are the reasons compelling enough to sell? So if do you hold a dud knowing it's a dud, and you just go, well, I'm just going to get my $500 a week, and it's not going to grow like I thought it would, or do you actively get out and redeploy the money somewhere else? So
opportunity costs.
And if it's Detroit, you sell, right?
So I'm I would say definitely, in that. But you're absolutely right. I think that leads to the next point in terms of the opportunity cost, right? Like, would this capital be better deployed somewhere else? Maybe even potentially in a different asset instead of property, right? But that's to say, keep it simple in a property sense. Would you be able to get the same or similar return, or even better return? That's the idea, having a better return, whether that's from a capital growth perspective, whether that's from a rental perspective, if you sell this property or redeploy that. So that would definitely be an important factor as well. I think the key challenges in today's market, though, is because of the economic uncertainty. In addition to that, there's lending aspects of it too, which I can talk about. If you sell some property, you might not be able to borrow the same amount again in order to get into an equal, price type of assets. Let's just put it this way. So, that's certainly part of the consideration. But putting finance aside, that just say purely looking from a data perspective, if my Granville property is only doing 2% capital growth annually, whereas if I look at a trend and I deploy somewhere in Adelaide, for example, into a house for the same type of capital, that might be a better opportunity cost, even though I might have to suck it up and sell that and take a bit of loss in the short term. But maybe if you look at a long term from a 10 years perspective, I'll be very grateful about that decision that I made. So so that's opportunity cost, which as well. I think the other one.
Sorry, David. I should have chimed in earlier. Just on opportunity cost, kind of hovering over that question as to could I get something better somewhere else, essentially, is the opportunity cost question. There's the cost of getting in and out, and the barriers to entry are quite high in real estate. So you've already lost 4% on stamp duty. You'd need to sell and incur all the costs associated with that. Let's say that's 2 or 3%, and then you'd need to buy something else, incurring stamp duty and other fees, and that's another 4%, let's say. So changing your mind in real estate can be very expensive. So you better be sure that what you're leaving is a dud and what you're buying into is a better opportunity. Because sometimes, and unfortunately, this is going to sound unprofessional, but sometimes you kind of just have to wear the mistake, and it might be more profitable not to get out and just chalk it up as education.
And you're spot on, John. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I haven't sold the Granville property
Right.
yet, well, because of that entry and exit costs, right? So, the exit cost obviously, involves the sales agent commissions. On top of that, yes, I'm still going to be making a profit on that property. So I will still be paying capital gains tax on that as well. On top of, in addition, if I deploy that capital to a new property, that's another 4% or even 6%, I think, from Adelaide, because their stamp duty is a lot higher. Adding all that up, how long would it take for me to be able to make that return back when everything, every little bit adds up? Now it's starting to look like, and when you crunch the numbers, it's like night and day to say, okay, well, maybe I should just suck it up and keep it more.
Because investing is a game of time. When you think about it in terms of time, so if you lose, let's say 8% on getting in and out of a property, you have to think about it not in terms of I've lost 8%, I've lost 2 years. And that's the way to think about it. So how long would it take me to make back my 2 years or my 8%? Yeah. And then I think you can think about what the right thing to do is. But yeah, there's definitely going to be mistakes for sure. And
that ties in, coming back again, there's so much uncertainty in terms of the next few years at the moment, whether that's from economic, whether that's from an employment perspective, there's a lot of factors to be played at here, which is why, most people would rather carry on with the mistake rather than having to, to sell and cop all that cost. So, yeah. Now, great point.
Yeah. Yeah, I like all that. I think we've covered supply quite well. I think the other couple of considerations are whether you bought a property with a specific objective, let's say a rezoning or something like that, or you want it to be near a piece of infrastructure, and that driver changes or gets eliminated. So let's say the council announces that they're no longer going to be considering that area for rezoning. That would probably be a reason to sell, because your reason for getting in has gone in. Let's say you buy a property near a station that you think is going to get upgraded or redeveloped, and the council or the state government announces that they're not going to be putting that metro line through. Yes. I think there are other reasons to consider selling. So I think that they're if circumstances change in relation to why you bought it in the first place. So and Warren Buffett talks about this. He said if the reason you bought it drops away and it's no longer the case, in those instances you would consider selling. And I think that's quite fair.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess the immediate thought that I had was how like Ryde Council allows a lot of duplex building fast tracking with certain frontages, right? So I know a lot of people scooped up that a house with certain frontage criteria, but just imagine if Ryde Council decided to pull back on that requirement, then all of a sudden the reason for you to hold that asset is no longer there.
So, that's right. Yeah. No, that's a good example too. Yeah.
So, but looking at a lot of times as well, like it's again unforeseeable circumstances to a degree, just because there's things that policies that you can't control. Like, this is external factors. While you can buy something for that, but it also comes down to the time frame in terms of getting this executed. That's using the same analogy. Let's say, for example, you don't have the capital to be able to build a duplex, so you decided to hold on to that property for maybe the next 5 years while you accumulate the capital. Who knows what could happen in the next 5 years if the government decide to change on that, right? So that could be another reason in terms of getting rid of this, which is unfortunately doesn't quite meet the original purpose, what you intend to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's one kind of final way, I think, to think about this question as well. And it's something you mentioned at the beginning where let's say you've got a portfolio and let's say it's five properties to make things easy. And you're considering which one to sell. Maybe you have to sell one because of circumstances. You're renovating and you need the money, but you've got to sell one and you have to choose which one to sell, right? Yes. I think that this is where a bit of portfolio analysis comes into it. So let's say let me add some spice to the question, David. Let's say none of them are underperforming. Let's say they're all performing exactly as you would like to. I'll answer my own question and I want to throw it over to you for some thoughts. But in terms of how do you decide which one to sell? The way I would look at it then is which one do I sell that least disrupts the balance of the portfolio? So, for example, if I've got 4 units and 1 house, I wouldn't sell the house. I would sell one of the units. And I would do that because I want to maintain the balance in my portfolio, and I don't want to sell the thing that would reduce the balance of the portfolio. So what if I've got 2 units, 2 houses and 1 townhouse? I wouldn't sell the townhouse, even if there's lots of equity there. I would choose something else. So I would push out possibly the least scarce asset, the asset that I could probably reacquire later on if I wanted to, and I would hold the asset that would probably be harder to reacquire in the future. So I think it would also be, to look at your portfolio and ask yourself, how many of X do I have? And can I afford to lose one? And then how difficult would it be to reacquire that in the future? So that's sort of looking at them as a portfolio, even if none of them are underperforming. It was a bit of a brain fart, David, and I do that from time to time, but I wanted to ask you what you thought.
That was a really good example, though. I mean, I can chip in as well, in terms of, so apart from obviously keeping the balance of the portfolio, you also need to consider the cash flow aspects of assets as well. Don't forget, at the moment, a lot of people are struggling because the property assets are very, very negatively cash flow. So that means it's draining a lot of your money from your own pocket. And some people might be forced to sell because of that, right? To free up a bit of cash flow and put a bit more money into the offset account. So in that case, then you'll be looking at which one is the most negatively geared, or the one that's giving you the most negative cash flow. Because unfortunately, as much as you don't like it, you might just have to cut loose of this guy. And then the rest of the cash flow would then come back into an equilibrium again. So gives you a bit more room to breathe. That's one aspect of it that I can think of. The other aspect I can think of, if I'm putting in that kind of position, I would certainly be looking at what are the future prospect that you could do to the properties.
Yes.
So, I've got properties that are units, which I can't do much. I've got properties that are on corner blocks that I could potentially build granny flats or subdivide later on. Then the decision is quite logical. You obviously want to get rid of, or unfortunately, letting go of the one that you can't potentially add more value down the track, whereas keeping the more value-add prospective players in your portfolio.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think the concept of potential, where is the potential, is such an important point. I'm going to throw one other kind of fly in the ointment. One other thing we can throw it against the wall and see if the cat licks it up, or whatever the analogy is. Sometimes you may not even have a choice, because sometimes you have to sell the property that has the equity in it. So if the purpose of divesting a property is to retire debt, you can't really sell the property that you just bought 3 years ago that doesn't have that much equity. You probably have to sell one of the properties at 20% LVR, because there's no other way to retire debt without selling, and it might be one of your best properties. So I wish we all had the luxury to sell the worst property in a portfolio, but sometimes you have to sell the property that has the most amount of equity in it, because you're trying to retire a bunch of debt, and that's always a shame when that happens. But these are we talked at the beginning about there being circumstances, and then individual circumstances which would drive you to sell a property, and attributes of the property that would want you to get rid of it. And there's also, it's a complex thing. There's all sorts of reasons why you need to get rid of a property, and sometimes you don't always get to sell the property that you want to sell. You have to sell perhaps one of the better ones.
No, I totally agree with you on that, John. I think, a lot of times, there's, depending on acquisition cost, depending on the equity position, as you said, you might not have an option to choose which one to sell, but, certainly the one to sell that can cover the cost, plus giving you a bit more back as well. So, no, that's very, very valid points, John. So I think that we cover pretty much the main 3 reasons: supply, opportunity cost, as well as properties that could have changed purpose and no longer meets the expectations and what we want. Let's briefly touch on the change of unforeseeable circumstances. So under what sort of personal circumstances would you be needing to sell an asset?
Well, in those personal circumstances, it would be there are 3 Ds, and I can only remember 2 of them. But there's death, divorce, and something else starting with D. But they would. I used to work for an auctioneer company. Yeah. So if there's a death, there'd be a sale of assets. Then if there's a divorce, there'd be a sale of assets. And these are circumstances. But if you're referring to other circumstances like with zoning and stuff like that, or personal circumstances?
Look, I think we just briefly touch on the personal circumstance, except for the last D.
Last D, I can't remember.
D.
Yeah.
Last D.
Yeah. So that those sorts of things. There are other things like retirement's nearing, and you want to sell property so you can retire the debt. There could be other things like there's a big expenditure, like you'd like to rebuild a house, or you'd like to renovate a property, so that there's a big unforeseen expense, or even a foreseen expense that you'd like, and then you need to sell a property to pay for that. So there's a bunch of reasons. One of the things I love about property, just to sort of zoom right out, is property gives you choices.
Yes. Although, having said that, when you look at selling every time, John, it does take time as well, right? We're not talking about shares. Like, properties are not liquidity assets at all. They're not liquid. So, it takes at least, from start to finish, I don't know, say roughly 2 to 3 months. And that's on a good run, from basically initially engaging a solicitor to draft up the contract, engaging sales agents to do a market appraisal. Sometimes you've got to do staging as well, marketing, all that stuff, until the time that it actually settles. That process could take anywhere between 8 weeks to 3 months, depending on how quickly you want to move. Right. So, if you're in a dire straight situation, needing that fund quickly,
yes,
it's probably not. It's probably not the
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Look, John, anything else you want to add? I guess under what other circumstances would?
I would say try not to sell. I mean, I'm firmly of that sort of. I've described myself as old-fashioned in the past, but if you can avoid selling, and try to plan as much as you can. I mean, that would be ideal. But there are going to be times when you need to sell. There are going to be times that assets underperform. And it's always a shame when that happens, but we're all grown-ups here, and sometimes we have to do what we have to do. But very interesting. I found this to be very nuanced. I mean, I've been on read forums about when to sell, and they're all very adamant about when a property is a dud. But this was a far more nuanced conversation about choices and when you don't have choices and so on. So I thought this was a really good chat. Really good chat.
Likewise. All right. Thanks, John. Well, I think that's another good discussion that we had. So we'll leave it at that on that note. And listeners, thank you again for joining us on another Friday. And as always, this is just our opinions today. Certainly, please do not take it as specific advice. You do need to seek professionals for those. And until next time, we'll see you again in another episode of Spark Your Fire. John and David.